and as a scientist, he works on molecular investigations of Phytophthora. Is this the correct way to pronounce it? Phytophthora, sorry, because it's Latin, so I can, being Italian. So he teaches a lot of courses, going from foundations in biology to introduction to bioinformatics and many others. And today is going to talk about other things about NIBLSE.
Yes.
Okay.
NIBLSE Part 2.
Part 2, NIBLSE Part 2.
Okay, so you can hear me on this microphone, and I'm going to make sure I use this computer here. Okay, so Anne already introduced the NIBLSE network a little bit. I'll do a quick refresher or quick introduction for those who did not attend the earlier session. I noticed that both Anne and I are presenting on NIBLSE right after breaks, and I assume that has something to do with our name, like maybe the organizers were worried about people getting hungry, so they waited till after the breaks, but we'll see if that's true or not. So NIBLSE stands for the Network for Integrating Bioinformatics into Life Science Education. And probably the take-home message for today is our address, nibbles.org. You can find a lot of what I'm going to be talking about at that website there. And just notice the cute spelling that we have for NIBLSE here. Okay, just quick recognition to the leadership team who helped gain the initial Research Coordination Network grant from the National Science Foundation. So as Anne mentioned, the objective of NIBLSE was to develop this, the overall objective is to work towards integrating bioinformatics education into life science curriculum, into curriculum at biology departments, neurosciences, and other life science departments. We have 4 different specific objectives to work towards the integration of bioinformatics into life science education. The first is to develop this network of educators who have an interest in this integration process. The second, as Anne mentioned a little bit, was to develop a set of core competencies. The third was to identify assessment tools to learn if our students really are gaining knowledge in those core competencies, the knowledge and skills that we want them to have. And then finally, to develop a number of resources, a collection of resources to help educators in those endeavors to integrate bioinformatics into life science education. So in my talk, I'm going to focus on just a couple of those objectives. Talk a little bit about the core competencies, which Anne alluded to just a little bit. I'll go into a little bit more about that. But mostly I'm going to introduce those to discuss what we've been doing with respect to developing a collection of learning resources to help educators integrate bioinformatics into their classroom. So as Anne mentioned, this work on developing a list of core competencies in bioinformatics that we think that every biology student and other life science students should know has recently been published. So you can find this. This was published last month in PLOS One. And so I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to what we did there, and you can get more details. So if we're interested in making sure that undergraduate students, when they finish up their bachelor's degree, have the necessary competencies in bioinformatics for either further study in life sciences or to go into careers in the life sciences, the first thing we had to address is, what do we identify as that core knowledge and skills that every student's going to need coming out of their undergraduate education? So to do that, what we did, as Anne mentioned, was to survey life science educators. We got survey responses from over 1,000 different educators. In addition to those survey responses, we also obtained several dozen syllabi from educators that were teaching either standalone bioinformatics courses or courses that integrated, that had a major component with bioinformatics, even though that might not have been their predominant focus. So after we gathered those survey responses and we examined those syllabi, we came to a larger discussion drawing upon the expertise of the NIBLSE community that involved dozens of members and ultimately the leadership team refined all of that knowledge that we gained to come up with a list of 9 core competencies. I'm not going to go through the details on that list. Again, you can see that in the PLOS One paper. I'll just mention, as you might expect, those core competencies fall into kind of the 3 major areas that interface in bioinformatics. So a number of those that are dealing with computational skills and computational knowledge, some statistical concepts that students that need to know, and then also how that relates to biology. And also thinking in that last competency about the implications of the knowledge that we can gain. So now that we've got this list of core competencies, that provides a framework by which educators can go into the classroom and begin to integrate those essential bioinformatics competencies into their classroom. The other major component that I want to talk about today is how we're trying to help promote that teaching of bioinformatics competencies in the classroom. And in particular, we want to address those biology and life science educators who may not have extensive training or any background in bioinformatics. So what kind of resources can we provide in order for them to feel more comfortable in integrating bioinformatics into their classroom? So the overall objective of what we've been doing here, again, is to simplify access to learning resources that an instructor could take into their classroom, as well as providing support materials that they might need in order to get up to speed on bioinformatics, so that they'd be able to, again, bring this into their own biology classrooms. So to do this, we set up a subcommittee in NIBLSE. Number of individuals have participated in that in the couple years that we've been working. I've been chairing that subcommittee since it was founded. Bill Tapridge is the current PI on the NSF grant. Also want to acknowledge Mark Pauly, who was the initial PI on that grant, and both of them have been active participants in this on this committee. Also want to particularly recognize Sam Donovan, who's brought a wealth of experience from a number of other initiatives that he's been involved with, and has been a major force in helping to direct our energies. And then finally, Robin Wright was the head of CourseSource at the time when she was a member of our group. And I'll be talking a little bit about how we're interfacing with CourseSource to make our learning resources more widely available. So we've partnered with the CUBES community, who've provided tremendous online resources. Sam Donovan is a major partner on that group. And they've really helped to provide the platform that's allowing us to share learning resources that are going to be useful for teaching bioinformatics in biology classrooms. So CUBES is a separate initiative, but they have a vast amount of computing resources that have been really useful to us. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we've tried to do is not to try to be redundant or try to compete with other collections of learning resources that are out there. And so early on, we've been in conversation with Robin Wright, who initiated or took the lead on CourseSource. And our goal is to develop our own collection, but also to allow the resources that we're developing to be more widely distributed through a more peer-reviewed system, such as CourseSource. And I'll talk more about that as we go on. So using the CUBES platform, again, you can go to NIBLSE.org. That'll actually take you into the CUBES system. We are now hosting a learning resource collection. Currently, it's in a tabular format. We're also moving into a resource card format that'll be rolled out in the coming months. Both of these are designed to collect resources that we've identified as being especially helpful for teaching bioinformatics skills and knowledge, and to make it in a platform that you can quickly find what you're looking for. So we've got so far a couple dozen learning resources that we've included in the collection. And the key component is that we have now identified those with each of the 9 bioinformatics competencies, core competencies that NIBLSE has identified. You'll notice, this is just a couple of those resources. You notice that some of those resources are actually linking to previously published resources that we've identified, such as resources on CourseSource. But this is providing one-stop shop service for individuals who are looking in particular to integrate bioinformatics into their courses. So in addition to resources that are already on CourseSource, we've identified a number of other resources that have been published in different venues, such as CBE Life Science Education. And we provide links to those different resources as well. So in addition to previously published resources that have gone through the peer-reviewed process, in our collection, we've also obtained a number of resources that have not gone through peer review, a number of draft resources. And I'm going to talk a little bit in the rest of the talk about what we're doing to help refine some of those draft resources to get them eventually to go into peer review publication. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what NIBLSE has done with the support of the CUBES resources, CUBES platform, in order to develop learning resource, what we call developmental incubators. So the rationale behind these incubators is that many educators have developed their own learning resources that they use in the classroom. They may have just used these once or twice. They're comfortable using them in their own classroom, but they're not ready to disseminate those more widely. For example, they may not have provided enough background information so that it could be used by somebody else who doesn't already have the expertise in that area. And so because those are currently unpolished, they haven't been widely disseminated. And what we wanted to do is to take the NIBLSE community and see if we could provide a collaborative environment, a supportive collaborative environment to help refine those kind of raw or draft resources and bring them to a more polished state so they could be used by other biology educators. And the hope was twofold. One is to develop more polished resources so that our collection of learning resources would be enhanced. But also we looked at this as a way of strengthening the NIBLSE community by developing these collaborations. And as I'll talk about, we've been largely successful in both of those regards. So what we looked at for growing our learning resource collection, besides those that were previously published resources, was to solicit contributions from the NIBLSE community. So we sent out a solicitation asking members to please submit resources that may not have been published, or if there's something that's been published that we should know about that relates to teaching bioinformatics, could you please direct our attention to that? So from that, we got maybe a dozen or so submissions at this point. Some of those were items that were previously published that we've included in our collection already. A number of those were raw resources that hadn't been published yet. And the hope was that these were diamonds in the rough that the authors would be interested in further refining. We've taken those raw resources and we've already put those on the collection in case people want to work with those already. Sometimes the authors were not interested in further refining those, but in many cases they were. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've done that. So the first thing that the Resource Review Committee did was to look at the resources that had been submitted, and we used a standardized checklist, a LORI form, that looked at those learning objects to see how compatible were they, most importantly, with addressing at least one of the NIBLSE bioinformatics core competencies. The goal was to be as inclusive as possible, but also during that evaluation, we kind of identified any weaknesses that there might be in those resources. So if authors were interested in further refining it, they could get that feedback from the Resource Review Committee using this standardized form. Then what we did was those authors who were interested, we developed what we call these incubators, which again was a collaborative group for the authors to further refine their learning resources. And then ultimately, the refined resources would be added to our collection. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about what exactly that incubator process is, what that involves. So these developmental incubators involve small groups of individuals who meet online to collaborate in order to refine a resource. There's going to be typically at least one of the authors of the original resource, possibly more if there are multiple authors on that resource. One of the members of the Resource Review Committee functions as the managing editor. We've developed a step-by-step kind of checklist that we go through in this process to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible in developing these resources. And then we've tried to compose groups that are small enough to be nimble and to be able to get everybody to meet on a regular basis, but also to provide different perspectives. One perspective we look for is somebody that has expertise in, for example, the particular knowledge or skill that the resource addresses. And then the other perspective that we're looking at is somebody that doesn't have expertise, that, for example, might be somebody who would be interested in bringing that resource into their classroom so that they can help us identify kind of what's the assumed knowledge, for example. So this is, again, online meetings. These groups meet all online. And we try to do it so that the group runs in about 1 or 2 months, typically a 6-month period, meeting every 2 weeks most commonly. So that involves maybe 4 or 5 meetings. And the initial meeting obviously is to identify what are some of the major refinements that could be done. Then in the subsequent meetings, the members give feedback, and then ultimately we have a final meeting to kind of wrap up the refinement process there. As I mentioned, the initial raw learning resource is published, but then also the refined learning resource is published. So we keep different versions throughout the refinement process, and all of those are available on the collection there. So, and then ultimately what we do is encourage authors to submit their work to either CoreSource or CBE Life Science Education for a more peer-reviewed process there. If you go to CoreSource, you know that you're going to get a peer-reviewed learning resource there. If you come to us, it's going to be a mixture of things, including links to published works. So basically, we've gone through the incubator process now about 3 or 4 times. A number of those resources are being submitted to CoreSource. Just want to talk about the most difficult part, actually, in this whole process is getting those initial resources, those raw resources that we can help authors to further refine. So if you're interested in participating in this project, just a number of things that we'd ask for your help with. One is to go to NIBLSE.org and to look at the collection, think about how you could use those resources and tell others about the resources. We'd appreciate any feedback that you have on those. And again, the CUBE system allows for feedback on individual resources. That's something that we're developing. If you have particular draft resources that you've developed that you use in the classroom that you think might be useful to other educators, but you don't feel comfortable yet sharing those because they need further refinement, I encourage you to submit that to NIBLSE. We have a whole online submission process. Part of that involves collecting metadata so that other educators can find your resource. Also tell us if you've got something that's already been published through peer review publication so that we can include it in our collection if you think it's relevant here. So, and also we encourage you, maybe you don't have a resource, but you'd like to participate in an incubator, either as an expert or as a non-expert. Maybe you're looking to incorporate bioinformatics into your classroom and you're looking for more resources. We could definitely use non-experts for their perspective in this process here. So I'll just finish up by acknowledging all the support that we've got in this endeavor, the NIBLSE community, especially the leadership team and the resource review committee, the CUBES committee, I should say the CUBE system, and also we had support from the NSF with this research coordination network. Thank you.
I'm glad I got up so quickly then. That was a lovely talk on a fabulous resource. Thank you. I'm just wondering, of your 9 competency areas, are there any where you're particularly lacking in raw materials? Are there any that you would like to flag to this audience?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Yeah. So we didn't talk about the coverage. We started to look at that. We've got about 24 different resources, and altogether, at least 3 resources address each of the 9 competencies, with the exception of the 8th one, which is scripting. So we are looking for kind of resources that deal with scripting that would be good for kind of, biology students. That's been one that's been the most difficult. So, okay, there we go.
I have a question that I will ask you.
Okay.
It is about if you use any fair criteria to annotate these materials when the process of refinement.
Yes, that's a great question. I attended the FAIR session yesterday, so it's something that's on my mind now, but has not been. So that's the short answer.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.